Sorry it took a little while for this video to be made. I recorded it once, but due to storage space, I couldn't record it fully. Anyways, welcome to my Bendy and the Ink Machine review. Now, unlike my Sonic the Hedgehog reviews, I'm gonna play this one a little bit differently because, well, it's mostly due to storage space, but yeah. I'm gonna be going over the story, gameplay, playing all the stuff a tidbit differently, since this isn't normally a game that I normally review. But yeah, Bendy and the Ink Machine is a horror game Bendy and the Ink Machine is a horror game about this guy named Henry, about his pal named Joey Drew, who just helping him. Well, Joey Drew wanting to show something to him. Now for this review, I'm not going to give full details on the story because that would make this video really long. And there has been several theory videos covering on this game's story. Like it's been pure nothing. But yeah. With that being said, let's get on to the story, shall we? We first enter the studio getting a note from our friend Joey Drew. Like I said earlier, he wanted to show this man, Henry Stein, something very special to him in the studio. But you know what the weird thing is? This isn't the actual studio. This is a version of the studio, made by the thing that Joey wanted to show Henry. That being the ink machine. This thing is basically able to do pretty much anything. Erase literal color, bring cartoons to life, if you name it. It can end people's lives. While finding information around the studio, Henry had to collect 6 objects to turn on to fully activate the ink machine. Along with the flow room that there is in the theater room. Little did Henry know something terrible would happen. That's right. The ink demon now follows Henry throughout the studio. He tries to seek a way out, seeking help, and overall just trying to find any way to get out of here. But no matter what, he cannot escape. No matter how many pals he will make, no matter how many times he will solve puzzles, and no matter how many times he will be spared. Oh yeah, and there's this guy named Sammy Lawrence who tries to sacrifice Henry for the ink demon to free his soul. Now, unfortunately for Sammy, it didn't go according to plan. The ink demon instead decided to go for him. Oh yeah, and there's this pal named Boris. My apologies for that. But yeah, there's this wolf named Boris, and he wants to stay with Henry as long as possible, whether he dies or not. He stays by Henry's back. By Henry's back, no matter how much life he has left. Throughout the entirety of Chapter 3, you're basically finding more information about the studio, and doing pesky fetch quests for Alice Angel, such as chopping bendy cutouts, getting valve cores, you name it. Chapter 4 is basically a carnival-themed type of story chapter. Henry tries to get through through some carnival games to progress as throughout more and more on the chapter, to find yet more and more information, and trying to find his way to rescue Boris. Yes, Boris has been stolen. And how ironic it was by that Alice Angel that sent us to do those pesky fetch quests. She is truly the worst. She is truly the worst character in this entire game. You know, on second thought, maybe these things are the worst. Ugh. Going through several bosses through people out through the entire studio, some of the most important members, believe it or not, and revisiting our quote-unquote old friend Norman Polk, who was at the end of Bendy Chapter 3, that I did forget to mention. My apologies. We get this cool scene where the projectionist and the ink demon fight each other to the death. The ink demon is trying to get more and more hostage throughout more ink to build up in his body. And Norman Polk will need to be finished off. Then we enter our ride where Alice Angel questions why we are here in the first place. And then we unfortunately get a visit from a friend that we tried to save, but we were too late.
Boris! Oh no, what has she done to you?
Meet the new and improved Boris. I took what I wanted. In return, I gave him so much more. And this time, there's no ink deal, no escape. Boris, tear him apart. Leave nothing.
Yup, that's what Alice Angel did to him. Now do you see why I called her the worst character in this entire game? Okay, to be fair, that still goes to the Butcher Gang, but you get what I mean. I mean, she's pretty cruel. And because of this, we have to use the same exact weapon that Boris gave to us as at the beginning of Chapter 3. It honestly makes it sadder, to be honestly. Obviously, Alice would get mad at us and charge at us, but she was too slow. Someone was able to catch up to her somehow. And now we move on to Chapter 5, where Allison and Thomas suspects us at first, but we start building up our trust to each other. They start building their trust to each other. So yeah. Honestly, I can see why a little bit of people hated this chapter when it came out, but I always thought the lore that I was introduced in this chapter was interesting, and it did at least bring some lore into us, like confirming some of our theories that Susie Campbell is indeed Alice Angel. Anyways, throughout this chapter, we prepare for the ultimate fight against the Ink Demon, and it's not going to be easy. Henry pulls 4 or 5 levers, and the Ink Demon is now stopped. And this is what happens. And then we make it to Joey's house. It's where we learned how this all started, which does leave to in confusion and how Joey even talked to us before we went to the workshop. Did he send us a letter or did he talk to us here? Regardless, though, Bendy and the Ink Machine's story was honestly good, and while there are some confusing parts from here and there, it's kind of fun to figure out what these mysteries lead up to. Now, unfortunately, a game isn't perfect with just the story. We need a game imperfect because of gameplay. Well, technically nothing is perfect, but you know what I mean. Anyways, we get into the gameplay, and this section will be a little bit short since the gameplay doesn't offer a whole lot, but it kind of makes, but at the same time, it makes sense for what the game is. Plus, I do think it works well. Now let me explain the gameplay. You play as Henry Stein from beginning to end, and the first chapter being easy, but more lore-based, and the second chapter being a bit more challenging. You have this axe that you helped yourself get through all those boards at the end of the first chapter. Now you use it to defend yourself from several enemies, and chop through some stuff. Now the combat for this weapon, I'll give it a pass. As the combat is pretty solid when all things considered, and it's not too bad. And all things considered. There are some times where it's a little bit wonky, where timing your slashes can be a little bit frustrating, but I don't experience those moments that much. I think the combat is good in all things considered, and the axe is definitely my favorite weapon. There will be certain objects that you have to search around the studio. And bear in mind you that the objects aren't that hard to find to begin with, but it could still be pretty fun. If it was randomly generated. A lot of people complained about Bendy Chapter 3 being randomly generated. However, I personally saw that as fun, and I honestly think they should have kept that in. Sure, keep them on the same level, sure, but make them randomly generated. Still. There will be Easter eggs that you can find throughout the studio, and some of them are pretty clever. The jet pipe range is not all that great. It's pretty frustrating to fight with a weapon like this. That's when I'm going around the studio. I personally think that gem pipe is a tidbit weak, to be honest. And there's even Easter eggs that you can make a different way throughout the chapter. Take this chapter, for example. Remember that Tommy gun that Alice Angel takes away from us? Well, guess what? There is a way to achieve it. But there are certain ways that you have to do it, though. That being getting through the inky path, turning the blob near the toy factory to the ink machine, and not die throughout the entire chapter. Now, how about the plunger? The plunger is bad, and the range is awful. I personally didn't like using this weapon pretty much at all. Well, to be honestly, why would you make a plunger a weapon in a horror game? Well, an indie horror game. Why would you do that? Think Demon will come around the studio, and you need to hide in these miracle stations, and to hide away from them. You can also use these vehicle stations from your advantage if you want to get away from certain Butcher Gang members or make searchers disappear full on. As for the syringe, this thing is okay, but I honestly prefer the axe a little bit more. I'd take it over the gem pipe, and plunger for sure because of how straight out it is. But but I'm not gonna lie, the range could be a little bit better. Now, as for the wrench, this thing is pretty much similar to the axe, only a little bit weaker. The, there will be times where you'll one-shot searchers, while other times that you'll have to two-shot them. And the range is pretty much like the gem pipe, but because of how powerful it can be at times, it's pretty good. In conclusion, I never really minded the combat in this game. I found there are times where I found it a bit frustrating, like with the syringe and and plunger, but other than that, the combat is harmless. However, the Butcher Gang members are really annoying though. The carnival sections are pretty good, though the shooting section is a bit frustrating if you're playing on PC. How are those boss fights? Honestly, good. I can say that I actually like every boss in this game. My favorite boss being the Bertram Piedmont boss, and all in all, it's pretty fun. In conclusion, the gameplay is actually not that bad. It actually has some things going for it, like how an indie horror game should. And allow me to express uh, how how honestly good these graphics can be. This is how graphics should look like in an indie horror game. Now, as for the soundtrack, this game has a really good soundtrack. I won't show any examples because it's not the best soundtrack in the world, but it's still pretty nice and pretty fitting for an indie horror game. Going over everything that I said, the story is great. It's with some confusing elements. The gameplay, it works really well, though it has some major flaws. The graphics are fantastic, and the soundtrack is extremely fitting. In conclusion, I had a lot of fun with Bendy and the Ink Machine. Always had. And while the developers of the game is heavily flawed, I thank them for making such an awesome game like this. Never did an indie horror game never did an indie horror game even surprise me like this one did. I have high expectations for stuff like Five Nights at Freddy's, but this was pretty surprising. In conclusion, I have a lot of fun with Bendy and the Ink Machine, and it's honestly one of my favorite indie horror games in general. With that in mind, guys, I definitely recommend you try this game out if you haven't. Yeah, there will be some things that you will experience from here and there, but will have a fun time. A frustrating time, sure, but also a fun one. I want to thank you guys for watching this video because this video has been wanting to be worked on for a little bit now, but I do have another video. But I have a video where I'm going to be ranking all the Forsaken AR skins into where all my opinions on them. Now, Now keep in mind, guys, that that video will. Now keep in mind, guys, that that video will be coming out around tomorrow. Oh, but yeah. With that being said, guys, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.